Trump said, screw those kids and screw the Department of Education too. Yesterday on March 11th, the U.S. Department of Education employees got an email. Evacuate the building by 6 p.m. Just like that. These mass firings are a part of Trump's broader plan to dismantle the DOE entirely. But before we get into why these layoffs matter, let's talk a little bit about what the DOE actually does, because there's a lot of people that don't fully understand its role. The DOE was created in 1979 by former President Jimmy Carter to consolidate federal education efforts and win support from the National Education Association, or the NEA. And despite conservative pushback since Reagan, the DOE actually plays a critical role in American education. The first one is funding schools. They provide billions of dollars to K-12 schools, mainly supporting low-income students and students with disabilities. And while more than 90% of public school funding comes from state and local governments, the federal government contributes about 10%. And that money is crucial because it funds programs like Title I for disadvantaged students, Title II, teacher training, and Title IV, student health and safety. And it also funds Pell Grants and student loans for higher education. Another role of the DOE is setting rules. It decides how federal money can be used and ensures schools follow certain policies to qualify for funding. Protecting civil rights. The Office of Civil Rights ensures that schools comply with civil rights laws preventing discrimination. Also collects critical information stats shaping future policies and funding decisions. If you're finding this breakdown helpful, hit the like button so more people see this. And if you want deep dives about education, subscribe. When we talk about dismantling the DOE, we're not just talking about bureaucracy. We're talking about stripping resources from schools, teachers, and students who need it the most. This shouldn't come as a shock. For decades, conservatives have pushed to eliminate the DOE. They argue that education should be left to the states, claiming federal oversight creates unnecessary bureaucracy. And because education isn't listed as a constitutional right, they see the DOE as expendable. And Trump has taken this to the extreme with his executive orders. He has aligned himself with the Heritage Foundation, the think tank behind Project 2025, a plan to gut public education. And let's not forget when he appointed Linda McMahon, yes, the billionaire wife of WWE Vince McMahon, as Secretary of Education. Now, at the time, I thought Betsy DeVos was a terrible choice, but at least she had a background in education. Linda McMahon, zero qualifications. This administration is proving yet again that educators and students are not a priority. And here's a fun fact. Our own Vice President, J.D. Vance, who hails from growing up in rural Ohio and Appalachia, most likely attended a Title I school. Ain't that something? Now back to these mass firings. Organizations like the Defense of Freedom Institute are already trying to justify the cuts, saying Secretary McMahon is taking decisive action to weed out wasteful, bureaucratic functions that provide no benefits for students. They claim funding for low-income students and students with disabilities will remain intact. But history tells us otherwise. Even if the DOE were eliminated, its key functions, like funding schools, enforcing civil rights laws, would be scattered across other agencies with less accountability. And manifestos like Project 2025 don't want to just cut funding. They want to phase out Title I funding, again, that would go to low-income students entirely over a 10-year period. That would be devastating. Schools that serve large numbers of low-income students depend on that funding. 2025 even proposes eliminating Head Start, an early childhood program that's been the lifeline of disadvantaged students. Again, this is not just about cutting government waste. This is about undermining public education itself. Let's take a second to talk about the human element of these firings. Education Week interviewed a DOE staffer who said, "I really didn't hear or see any reaction to the email until I got into the elevator to leave the building." This woman said, "We're all being fired." I was like, oh, okay. It hyped everybody up. Obviously, everybody is certainly on edge. I can relate. One of my goals after grad school in 2019 was to work for the Department of Education. I had colleagues and peers who worked there. And if you've ever been laid off, you know how devastating that can be, especially in a city like DC, where childcare alone costs between $1,500 and $2,500 a month. That's somebody's rent. That's somebody's mortgage. This isn't just a budget cut. This is a huge slap in the face to public servants dedicated to improving education for not only our current students, but for future generations. It's easy to think of federal education policy as something distant, something that only affects people in Washington, D.C. But these firings have real implications for folks like me working in schools on the ground. So for context, I work in a school district. My main role is collaborating with stakeholders to build systems that support students with mental health challenges. I've been working with a lot in self-contained classrooms. Many of the students I serve come from urban, economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Today on a work call, we're literally discussing about what's happening at the federal level will impact us locally. When federal education policies shift, especially in this administration, states either have to fight back or fall in line. Remember, less federal funding means less mental health counselors in schools, less funding for student support programs, more pressure on teachers to manage crises without proper training. The fight for public education is just bigger than this moment, and this is just one piece of much of a larger problem. My latest video connects all the dots. Check it out.